we were told that we were going to go to the moon. We were planning and we're training and we're doing everything. You know, sometimes you get into a project that you really never quite see the end. You're working hard, you forget about the final part, the completion. And that to me was sort of the way I felt. We're going to the moon, we're training this, we're doing that, we're learning something else. And then it was on the day of the launch, before light, it was still dark when the three of us went up to the gantry. Now you have to remember that there's no one else around except a couple nervous checkout people. The rocket itself is filled with 5.5 million pounds of high explosives. Everyone else is a comfortable 3.5 miles away. And as my two companions were the first to go into the spacecraft, where the gantry is some 330 feet tall, and there's a bridge across there, they walked across it and they went into the spacecraft. I was left alone, fully suited up, and breathing pure oxygen. And I looked at the night and I saw these lights come down, and this was the press corps that was manning the press sites at that particular time. And then I looked down and I saw the ground, and I looked at the press corps and I said, these people are really serious. We're going to go to the moon. And you know, it suddenly dawned on me that this was not another Earth orbital flight. This was the accumulation of the training we had done and the decisions we had made, that unless something in the next couple hours happened, this spacecraft and this rocket were going to take off, and we're headed for the moon.
Nobody had ridden on the Saturn V, and even though there'd been, what, 2 unmanned Saturns, apparently they didn't have the accelerometers in the right place, because they no sooner lit this thing off when I realized that we had missed one major part of the simulation. The sideways vibration with those big, huge 1.5 million pounds thrust each engines, gimbling around, trying to keep this thing straight. The center of gravity was way down here. We were up here like a ladybug on the end of your automobile antenna. So as it moved down here an inch, this thing moved a foot. And I literally felt like I was being thrashed around like a rat in the jaws of a terrier. And I was convinced that the fins were bouncing up the girders of the spacecraft, of the launch tower. Also, the noise was deafening. There was no way we could communicate. Now, Frank, he told me later, was smart enough to take his hand off this launch abort handle, because as fighter pilots, it's much better to die than it is to screw up. And that's why we're all short, you know. And but there was no way, if I detected, I was sort of the flight engineer, and so if I detected any kind of problem on the instruments, I couldn't see them. They were just kind of going like that. I wouldn't have been able to communicate them to Frank, and if I had seen him and communicated, he wouldn't be able to do anything about it anyway. Well, it seemed like an hour when we cleared the tower, and the noise started coming down a little bit, and things smoothed out, and I thought, boy, if we missed that in our training, what else have we missed? So it was pretty spectacular. And then as we burned the fuel out of this first stage, it's extremely heavy, probably, what, half of the weight of the vehicle? That's when it was loaded. As it burned its fuel down, the whole thing became much less massive. But the thrust was the same. You know, for those who went to high school physics, F equals ma. So as F is the same and m goes down, a goes up. So at cutoff, what do we have? About 4 Gs, something like that, 4.5 Gs. Suddenly, the rocket cut off. Instantaneously, some retro rockets fired. Then a primer cord sheared off the first stage. To me, where my fluid, we were on our backs, so the fluid in my ears were pinned to the back of my head. And suddenly it all sloshed forward. And I could not resist throwing my hand up in front of my face. Like, it felt like I was being catapulted, like one of these Captain of Castile catapults, right through the instrument panel. Okay, and so I threw my hand up. About the time my hand got up here, the second stage cut in. Whack! So I looked up and I had my helmet on, and here was this gash across my helmet. And I thought, oh gosh, you know, when the big boys see this, you know, it's going to just, you know, justify the rookie position. Well, we made it into orbit, and somewhere along the line, I collected the helmets, and I noticed that the other two guys each had a slash. So my point is there's no rookies on the first Saturn V. Everybody's a rookie.
The launch was exciting, and then we went on to the coast. We went around once and a half around the Earth, and then was over Hawaii, wasn't it? We got the go for TLI, much go for translunar injection. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't think we would ever get that because I knew darn well that NASA wouldn't commit us unless everything was really perfect. But over Hawaii, Mike Collins said, Apollo 8, you go for TLI. We lit the S-4B, started out, picked up, 25,000 miles an hour?
35,000 feet a second.
35,000 feet a second, 25,000 miles an hour, and started toward the moon. Now, in order to keep the heat load equal on the spacecraft, if that was the sun, we positioned ourselves perpendicular to the sun and then just rotated all the way to the moon. I think we probably have the record for revolutions.
Yeah.
And it
Barbecue mode.
Yeah, we call it the barbecue mode. About 2 or 3. I might as well get this out of the way right now because it'll come up sooner or later.
And it came up.
I began to feel funny.
I'll tell you, it wasn't a bit funny.
You know, Jim Lovell and I had flown for 2 weeks, and I'd never gotten sick. I'd never been sick in an airplane, but I really wasn't feeling too good. And so I managed to throw up all over him. And that caused great consternation back on Earth when Anders wanted to squeal on me. I wouldn't let him. So finally he dumped it on the tape, and they read about it. And then
8 hours later, I covered his tail for 8 hours.
But interestingly enough, all the scientists, and Dr. Van Allen was convinced that we got fried going through his ionosphere belt. This, not the doctors were going nuts, and we wanted, as if they couldn't decide whether or not they were going to abort the mission. They didn't have much to say about it, really.
Frank, I have to tell you this right now, but we were going to the moon regardless of what happened to you.
Exactly. One of the important things on the flight plan was when we would lose communications with the Earth. Because as you go around the moon, the communications would be blanked out because it was S-band radar that we were using to communicate. And so that was a very critical point. We had never seen the moon, as John mentioned. And it was perfect darkness, and we were flying backwards, aiming 240,000 miles, aiming for a place 60 miles above the lunar surface. So I was watching that time very, very, very closely. And hoping that we were on track. And just at the minute we were supposed to lose communication, we lost it. And I thought, boy, that's great. What a wonderful deal. I said, we just lost it right on time. And Anders says, well, they probably turned the damn radio off.
That's right.
Okay, now I got you to the moon. You guys take over.
Well, as Frank said and as John said, we didn't see the moon because we weren't supposed to look at it because the sun was sort of right behind it. Afraid we'd hurt our eyes. But when we oriented the spacecraft going backwards along our path, just as we were cutting in front of the moon, like high schoolers trying to outrace the train in their jalopy and beating it by a yard, we went into the shadow of the moon, where we were both in the shadow of the moon from the sun and the shadow of the moon from Earthshine. And it was dark. I mean, it had been kind of just, the sky was sort of a gray. You couldn't see stars very well, but it wasn't dark coming to the moon. But now it was black. There were stars everywhere. You couldn't tell which ones they were. There were so many. And I remember looking back and seeing all these stars, and suddenly there was this big black hole. And I got to tell you, the hair went up on the back of my neck, because that was the moon. And when we popped out of that shadow and relit our engines, we were in lunar orbit.
That was one of the major decisions we had to make because, if we had any problems at all, we'd circumnavigate the moon and come back again. So one of the decisions and what we had to do behind the moon with no communication with the Earth was to, of course, light the engine to slow down. And once we did that and everything looked perfect, and then when we looked at the computer, it showed that we were in the exact orbit. I think at that time it was about 60 by 160 miles in a sort of elliptical orbit to begin with. So everything on this particular flight up to now was working perfectly.